Good morning. My name is Mark Erabogbo. I'm the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Special Interest Group with the FENG, the Financial Executives Networking Group. The FENG is the largest invitation-only executive finance group in the world. It's excellent for deal flow, for networking, for building friends, et cetera, et cetera. If you do not use the database, I suggest that you do. Log in, whether it's, you're working on a project, you're looking for a CFO, et cetera, et cetera. I found some great resources on here. So introducing our topic today, the geopolitics of energy, US-Russia relations and the energy transition. And our speaker for today is Adam Mickiewicz, a senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Kleinman Center for Energy Policy and a non-resident fellow in energy studies at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Anna's research focuses on geopolitics of natural gas within the EU, former Soviet Bloc, and Russia. Her current interests include the potential use of natural gas as a geoeconomic tool, ways in which US LNG exports could bolster European energy security, the role of hydrogen in the sustainable energy transition. Anna received her law degree from Adam University in Poznan, Poland, and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Windsor in Canada, and a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Houston. She speaks Polish, English, German, Farsi, and Russian. And if you haven't checked out her new book, Monetizing Natural Gas in the New Deal Economy, please do so. She wrote that with Michel Michaud-Foss and Ghassan Gulen, hopefully I said that correctly. And then she also has a recent article in The Hill on waste sanctions on the Russian pipeline and more about China than Russia. Miss Anna Mickiewicz, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me, and many thanks to everyone for participating. I really appreciate it, and I would really like this to be more of a conversation than a lecture. I feel this way we can all participate. We can be, it can be interactive, and nobody gets too bored and kind of phases out. I know after. So I teach, and I was always, whenever I would learn how to teach, I was told you should never speak more than 20 minutes at a time, because later on everybody phases out, doesn't matter how interesting the topic is. So let's make sure that nobody phases out, that everybody's engaged, and we have actually fun looking at the issues that are at stake. So my idea about the topic is kind of go through the big one, and then later kind of slowly, trickle down to the US-Russia relation. And the big one is really the energy transition that everybody is currently talking about, right? There is energy transition. We talk about COVID, how it could lead to more transition into renewable and so on. And that's a conversation, a lot of particularly developed countries have. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen because there is some slides that will help everybody kind of to look what's really going on and what we think is going to happen going forward. I think the important thing to underscore is that the energy relations or energy industry always transitions. There's always a transition. The fact that we're talking about the transition doesn't mean that it just happened. We've seen that transition, years, decades, hundreds, and centuries. But I think that the difference today is how much countries are involved into creating that transition. How much of a policy push we have, and how much of a societal push we have. I think that the last time there was this big of a push is when Churchill decided to switch his fleet from coal to oil, and made oil so important for the military might of the UK, of England. And how it kind of later structured the interests of England and other nations, which kind of would aspire to be part of the naval might globally. Let me see how. Okay. Yes. So today, when we are looking at the transition, there is two distinct group really that think about that transition, and it really divides between the countries that are wealthy, they developed, and those that are developing. And in the developing countries, we see that, in the developed countries, we see that the reducing emissions is important, and especially in the electricity sector, we have this push, in particular of a policy push for renewables and cleaner fossil fuels and so on. In the US is slightly different in the way that we have had quite a lot of influx of natural gas that helped decarbonize without necessarily the policy push that, for example, EU has experienced. There was no need for it because the prices actually substantiated such a substantiated switch from coal to natural gas, and decarbonization kind of became almost natural way of progression. But that's because there is so much natural gas around, and when the fact is that we often think about countries being virtuous or non-virtuous about thinking about their transition to specific types of energy. But truly, before the shale revolution happened, US was very much on the road of higher renewable transition. The reason for it was expensive natural gas and the fact that you really wanted something that's cheaper, economically cheaper, right? So had it not been for the shale revolution, we probably would have seen a different trajectory, potentially more policy-based, that is more akin to what's been happening in the EU, where natural gas is not, natural gas has to be imported for the most part and is declining in terms of domestic resources and is more expensive. And hence there is this search for other fuels that is also based on policy and ideology in terms of decarbonization or so on, but also as much about economy and potential dependence on other countries. And that's where we also then go to the developing world, which often doesn't have access or readily access to natural gas. However, it does have access to much more common coal. And the way it looks at the development of energy relation is based on the impact on economic development and improved standard of living of the population, more so than focusing on climate change. And hence then there's this rift between those two worlds, as we call it in the book, of at least with regards to the natural gas, of the old world of gas supply or gas demand, where countries have been used to natural gas, they kind of, they've grown economically, these are the wealthy developed economies, and the new world of demand, where countries are looking at other ways in which they can bring in a lot of reliable, cheap energy to support their development and their growing populations. So, as I mentioned, rising economic prospects for billions. It needs energy use needs to increase for both industry and customers, and in the developed countries, the climate and change the climate goals are the ones that kind of really have grown to be associated with energy policy trends. Just wanted to kind of show you, that's from the BP Outlook, what is happening with the energy consumption, and we'll see that that the energy consumption is growing, and depending on the scenario. So BAU scenario is business as usual scenario. If we see basically nothing changes, the world has, the world is kind of going in the same trajectory, the same policies and so on. We see that that energy demand in the developed world actually decreases. And same goes, of course, and even more when there is a net zero scenario of development. Now, so we see decrease in those places where climate policies are the most important ones that are leading, while where we see increase of energy demand is the emerging economies, where the climate concerns are not as prevailing, or they are secondary to the needs of economic development, raising standards of living, raising people from poverty, billions from poverty. And one thing that we need to think about is, what the ratio of the population is definitely not on the developed world side. It's like 1/5 to the rest of the world that's emerging right now. So this gives us kind of idea what really needs to be done if we think about energy transition in a way that we want to think. So is energy transition going to bring us decarbonization? Can we really bring up the goals of climate change? Can we really decarbonize and so on? And if we really think only within the developed world perspective, not paying attention to what the developing world is doing or how they could be incorporated, how their goals could be incorporated, then we are kind of risking not really achieving our goals. Because the fact that we are decarbonizing locally doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to happen where the demand for energy is actually increasing and not decreasing the way it is in the US or Europe. So I just also wanted to show you the world electricity generation by fuel, because I think this is quite important, and something that people don't often realize is how prevailing not only fossil fuel, but especially coal is still. I mean, it's changed slightly, but not that much by 2020, 2021. How prevailing coal remains, how it is basically much more than any other fuel providing electricity. And when you think about the fact that US, Europe have already pushed coal far out, and it's the developing nations that are driving that remaining use of coal, and the fact that they will be bringing in increasing amount of electrification and energy demand, well, then there is always this thing, what can we really do beyond looking into our silo of developed nations, and how we can really affect the global decarbonization. And this is just kind of for you to see where the oil demand is going. You see US kind of, depending on, so the orange, the blue one is 2018, orange is business as usual scenario. And then the gray is a net zero scenario in the BP outlook. And you see that its oil demand is generally seen as decreasing for most part, unless this is business as usual scenario and it's Asia Pacific or emerging economies. So this is something that people are kind of really going to be interested, because there is this nowadays notions that we are really seeing oil oil demand decreasing to the point of oil becoming not useful and kind of really achieving its peak at that time. Whether this can happen or not, that's one thing, but this also will, as we go through it later, will also impact the way countries deal with each other. And we talk about how energy has been used for geopolitical goals. In particular, really natural gas has been heavily politicized on the global level, global, actually regional, in the past. Because natural gas is not very easy to transport, and it used to be that it was really transported via pipelines, which requires, for the most part, a very regional approach to trade. In that way, those countries who would have natural gas within their territory and would be able to supply others would become either dominant providers, sometimes monopoly providers, and often, like Russia in Europe, could and would use their position to gain political influence within the region, or be able to push a specific country to specific policy behaviors. So when we look at the different scenarios, natural gas you'll see that natural gas is particularly in the emerging economies almost the same, even under the net zero scenario in 2050, which I think for some people who are currently really engaged and pushing for energy transition might be surprising, because lots of what we see now is call for just stopping fossil fuels altogether, and using renewable power and so on. And while this is quite important, technically or technologically, we are not there yet. And unless there is some kind of huge technological breakthrough, we won't be stepping into non-fossil fuel energy world anytime soon. However, I think one thing that people often forget is that the idea of decarbonization, it's decarbonization and not defossilization, and which means that we should be really putting pressure on less carbon in the atmosphere. And how we achieve it, then, well, there are different options, right? And we've seen there's CCS, hydrogen, and so on, how we can decarbonize. If we can decarbonize fossil fuels, then they can also be part of the decarbonization goals. Coal, which is very interesting, I think, because you see the coal really persisting if the policies don't change much, if the world doesn't change much throughout the emerging world. And that's kind of where we see same. But as we look at others, well, we'll see there's gonna be a huge growth in renewables too. Wind demand, particularly in net zero, but also in business as usual. Same thing for solar demand, same thing for solar demand. But going back to what I was mentioning, even when we look at the IEA rapid energy transition scenario, and we've also heard it many times from pretty much every single CEO of a large company we've had in the Baker Institute talk recently. And I really encourage everybody to kind of go to the YouTube YouTube page of the Baker Institute. We have very interesting webinars on energy policy, including many with the CEOs of Equinor and BP and so on, and Exxon, where they kind of really point to the fact that even if we decrease the use of fossil fuels, we really will still need investment to make sure that the world can operate to provide enough economic gain to sustain its society, its populations. The other thing that I think it's very important to point out is that we often focus in the energy transition on the big, international oil companies, thinking Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Equinor, BP, and so on. But it's not really those companies that command most of the oil, for example. And the same goes, do I have the gas? No, I don't think I have the gas, but it's very similar for gas. It's the national oil companies that do own most of reserves, both for oil and gas. And that kind of goes again to the issue of what role will and can energy play in geopolitical realm. Because if it's national oil company, aka countries, controlling most of the reserves for both oil and gas, limiting international companies in their activities might not necessarily mean that globally we end up with less gas or less oil. It only means that we will see the switch from international oil companies selling oil and gas based on market and market principles to countries or nations selling gas through their national oil companies, where it doesn't need to be on the market principles, particularly if no IOCs are involved. And then it's the policies of a specific countries that will actually weigh on how potential gas or oil is distributed. And that's where we get to this geopolitical part of energy, where energy could be used by countries to influence other countries or get the policies enacted by other countries that a specific gas or oil exporter wants. So we'll see here that, again, kind of goes back to where the population is increasing, and you will see, and that's exactly how we'll see also the energy consumption increasing. We'll see that, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, Asia is where really we will see population increase, the largest population increase. And if so, this is particularly as those countries develop, we'll see the huge growth in energy demand and in energy, and depending on what these countries choose to use as their supply of energy, we might be in more or less trouble in terms of our idea of energy transition, decarbonization, and so on. And here I wanted to, because I was put so many things in BP, but RFF, Resources for the Future, they actually have issued a really nice report which combines and compares all these different outlooks that we've seen from IEA, BP, IRENA, Equinor, and so on, and the scenarios that there are, and kind of, I think it's really, really interesting because we can compare across and see what these scenarios mean for the future of energy, and we see that even in those very stringent scenarios, fossil fuels are still there. Even coal is still there, although not in this big of a share of energy use. And one caveat I really wanted to point out too, it's oftentimes in many talk points in terms of energy transition point to the decreasing share of coal, of natural gas, of oil, or increasing share of renewables. And I think this is very important because share does not mean volumes. And as we will see going forward, the energy demand will increase. So even smaller share under many scenarios for coal, natural gas, or oil or so won't mean lower volumes. And that's very important for decarbonization because we don't care about share in decarbonization. We really care about volumes because these will be reflected in the amount of carbon we'll see in the atmosphere after burning those fuels.
Anna, is geothermal also included in other renewables there?
I believe so. Yeah, it's usually, let me see. I'll share the screen again. Where am I doing? So bionuclear, other renewables, that's gonna be geothermal.
Okay, fantastic, super. Folks,
always. Yeah, I never see geothermal as a separate category. Okay. It's usually wind, solar, hydro, and then other renewables, which can be geothermal. It also can be, for example, biofuels, right? Oh no, biomass is actually here. So,
sure.
Yeah. Any other questions before I kind of move on to the next part, which kind of really focuses on Russia and US position as energy exporters?
Yeah, folks, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to briefly ask, some questions. We want to make this very interactive, and so. Cod, you look like you have something that you want to say. I can see it in your face. I can see it in your face. Go ahead.
I'm good. I'm fine. I'm just kind of looking around, and I'm good.
You still taking it in? Okay, fantastic.
Hi, this is Rob Shaw. I just wanted to ask a question. We see that coal remains a big source of energy for the developing countries. Is there any scenario where we could see that change in the future? And also, what percentage of that coal demand is China? I'm assuming it's a big chunk.
Yeah.
But if you could just wondering if there are any scenarios where that would.
So China is a big chunk. China is a big chunk, and I really don't know what the percentage is. India is a big chunk. And in fact, when you compare the trends between China and India, you see the volumes in China actually a little bit dipping, whereas in India they are increasing. And that's kind of related to the fact that China has better diversified its energy supplies. So it brought a lot of gas from different supply sources. Nuclear is another one. It has wind, solar, and kind of this centrally, planned economy has enabled China to create this very diversified market where coal remains very important, and it's for diversification reason, but also think about it, this is owned domestically by China, so it's energy security reasons, and that's why many countries are sticking to coal, because if they don't have any other supply, they don't want to be geopolitically dependent also, not only economically, but also geopolitically dependent potentially on other countries, or exposed at least to geopolitical risk from other countries. And then also when you think about coal, it's a lot of jobs. And that's why countries have quite a lot of issues of getting rid of coal, because it might be less problematic for China potentially because the coal miners don't vote there in a way they vote in democracies. This is not the case in India or places where I'm from, Poland, for example, which has serious issues getting rid of coal, even though that coal is actually not economic anymore. When you think about it, especially under the EU system of coal credit and so on, but countries stick to it. In addition, China, for example, builds coal-fired power plants domestically still. India just as much, but China also exports those coal-fired power plants. It actually builds in other countries in Asia. So if for whatever reason they don't burn coal domestically, they can still transfer some of it, for example, to other countries. So there is a lot of this kind of inbuilt issues that work with coal, and I think I don't see yet a solution that would propel the developing world to get rid of coal in a way that we think about it in the developed world. For those purposes, I mean, for those reasons, the economy, energy security, and jobs. I think there are ways in which this can be incorporated, and we can think about it. We can think about, how to decrease the carbon levels that are, from burning coal. Can we create hydrogen from coal, create a hydrogen economy within which jobs are developed that can actually, substitute as we go for the coal mining jobs and so on. And in that kind of even, if kind of phase out coal in a more natural way where population is not as affected economically. And I think that's hard for the developed world to hear. But I think we really need to think of what the developing countries are standing against in that decarbonization issue, within those decarbonization issues.
Thank you.
Chiron had a question.
Yes. One factor that's going to impact, energy demand and usage is access to capital. Right now, the ESG principles are really wreaking havoc on the industry. So how do you see ESG principles affecting not only just the use of energy, but also the type of usage?
I think those principles are quite, important, particularly for the IOCs, really, the international oil companies, because they almost can create a niche and create a reasonable justification for the fossil fuels to actually function from the perspective of the developed societies. And I think that's the important part, is to make sure that we still see development, we still improvement, technological improvement, and this goes forward. I don't think that all right, I don't see many of the NOCs, national oil companies, really being strict about it. And as I've mentioned, these are the places which really own the most of gas and oil and gas, and where we will see that, that if the production increases, it will increase there. Of course, access to capital is an issue. But again, when you think about this, this goes back to the geopolitics. We see that China is heavily invested in, it's heavily investing in other countries, fossil fuels, but generally in energy. Same thing with Russia. So these places will see, if we back out, there will not be vacuum, and we will see actors which are less committed to environmental or excellence or generally quality excellence than us, less committed to market values, and in that kind of negatively impact the goals that we want to achieve. And it's interesting, because when we think about the in silos, we think about US or EU, how about we get rid of all the fossil fuels, don't sell it, don't develop it, and so on. But there's been actually a very recent by Western nations, there's been a study which actually shows that US LNG shipped to Asia, China, India, Taiwan, actually can achieve between 42 and 55% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions if it replaces coal. And that includes everything, all the greenhouse gases, the methane, the CO2, and so on, the transportation, everything, which shows you again how it's not a good idea to think in silos, but think about where our emissions can be coming from and how we can create the excellence. And ESG is very important here. How we can create the excellence in which the investment in fossil fuels and kind of incorporating them within the energy mix can become justified or socialized almost within our developed societies, which are currently, more often than not, negatively, set or which view the fossil fuels in a negative way. But again, in the global view, this could be not necessarily a good thing for decarbonization or climate change. Mm-hmm.
Superb. We have Justin, Amar, and Anicia. Either of you can chime in. I see you have your hands raised.
Hi, Adam. Anicia, I was just wondering if any thought to policy with regards to integrating the drivers for economical growth in developing countries has been thought through. Are they getting help with regards to developing out their economical structures and making sure that they inject more low carbon energies within that structure without compromising their potential for growth?
I think there is a talk about it, but the way I've been, from what I've seen, I don't think there is enough understanding of how crucial, access to cheap energy is for countries. And I really don't, and that kind of goes back to the idea of, for example, not allowing to borrow for fossil fuel, any fossil fuels development. Whereas, for example, when you think, when you think about, Latin America, Africa, or so on, and particularly, I think Africa is interesting because they don't have coal. That it's only South Africa that does, and so what's happening is, for now we see biomass being used, and people say it's great, it's renewable, but this biomass is not used in a way that it's actually quite negative, has negative impact on local air quality, for example. Because it's being burned in stoves, it actually creates quite a lot of indoor pollution, which people die from later on. And having natural gas, which is abundant in places like Mozambique, for example, right? Not only being shipped out, but also being used locally is very important. Now, the big deal in places like Latin America, like Africa especially, is the on-the-ground issues with politics and what's happening in terms of corruption, politics, and so on. And I think that's where there's very crucial to make sure that it's treated in the developing world. It's treated kind of, as a whole, as opposed to kind of putting investment here and there and not treating the underlying issues beyond that. But I haven't seen a well-developed policy that would be looking at it. There is some talk about, allowing investment in some places for fossil fuels, but generally we see like the European investment banks, the World Banks kind of going away from, and I think it could hurt a lot of countries also in Asia, Southeast Asia, where China is building those coal-fired power plants. Why not to provide an investment for actually using natural gas in a way that those countries can not only be tied to one market, but also diversify its supply, and in that way be less wary of replacing coal with natural gas. So I think that's very important that to think about it. But truly, I haven't seen a very well kind of devised policy yet on that.
And I just had one final follow-up question. So thanks for that. Has there been any pushback from some of the governments within the region, maybe from Trinidad and Tobago? We're still very much and going to be a natural gas economy, given our closeness to the Venezuelan region and the fact that we share a maritime border with Venezuela. So my question is, has there been a strong pushback from developing countries in a more unison frame to say, hey, you had your time to develop and you created this problem, right? We want the opportunity to develop and provide opportunities for our citizens so that we can reduce the amount of corruption. So I just kind of wanted to know if there's some agency within developing countries to communicate that effectively to other groups who are not well in tune with the challenges that developing countries face.
So because I don't really focus much from what I have surveyed, I haven't seen one beyond the fact that a lot of countries, for example, the recent IEA different scenarios on the world development, how to get to net zeros, they were rejected quite broadly by a lot of the developing world. Japan was not happy with it, for example, because it really depends on a lot of fossil fuels and it cannot get rid of them that easily. So I think, but I haven't seen specific, particularly that Africa is not my area of expertise. There's a really good group, and it's Hub for Development, I think. Todd Moss, I'm not sure if you've ever Todd Moss is its director, and they focus particularly on Africa and electrification, natural gas. It's great. And you can email me or reach out on LinkedIn, and I can send you the link. Particularly, they amazing, really good studies, and Todd is really an expert.
Excellent.
Thank you. I'll do so.
Is there anyone that can chime in that has any thoughts on emerging markets or Africa for the conversation? Don't be shy. Okay, so Amar, you had a question for us.
Yes, I had two questions actually. The first question was, do you feel that with the advent of renewables in the last 20, 30 years, that nuclear is now a declining option, particularly after Fukushima, and decisions by countries like Germany to turn their back on nuclear power because of the data fears of the safety fears. Do you think nuclear is now kind of like a dead option going forward?
I think it depends where. So yes, we see the Germany kind of turning away for whatever reason. Really, I think they've made several very interesting decisions of getting rid of nuclear coal at the same time, and incorporating just natural gas and renewables pretty much, which has been and will be very difficult. We see the aging French infrastructure, which will be interesting. They haven't invested yet enough to replace it. So we'll probably see in France increase in natural gas use, and they've been actually pushing quite a lot for things like hydrogen and renewables too, to diversify their energy use. But I'd say they probably will be doing quite a lot of maintenance on their older units and still using quite a lot of that, if not building new ones. But where we see really a huge increase in nuclear energy growth, or huge growth in nuclear energy, is again the developing world. China, Saudi Arabia, places like Turkey, countries within Europe. So Poland is looking at nuclear currently. Czech Republic is looking at nuclear currently. And that's that's where we will see growth actually. It's just gonna be in different countries than we used to. There is some, I think there is some push for like micro nuclear or small nuclear projects. I've seen this in Poland. I'm not sure whether I think there's some push on this in the US. But I think now, again, within the geopolitical realm, it is a place for competition for countries that do have nuclear technology. And this is where countries like the US and Russia compete, because that's where these different types of nuclear technology, once installed, that creates a certain dependency and certain ties, and creates a geopolitical potential for each countries. I think, Hungary, I think, is trying to build another nuclear, and that using Russian technology. Poland is looking mostly at the US technology, but also French and Korean. So there's a lot of, China is building, I think, in Saudi Arabia. So there's quite a lot of nuclear going on. It's just not where we used to.
Okay, the follow-up question I had was, you mentioned India and China as being, heavy consumers of coal, because certainly in Western Europe and probably in North America, I think coal consumption has gone down quite considerably. In the situation of India, which has a very warm or hot climate, is India looking from a energy security point of view to actually diversifying to solar? Because obviously they have a very natural abundance of sunshine,
yes.
In that part of the world. So surely, that's one way that they can actually save money and be more energy independent.
That is true. However, the issue is still in the intermittency of that resource. So when you think about, I think solar is great, particularly where there is no grid connections, where it can provide electricity for households, which had none before. But the issue becomes what happens when we want to develop industry. We want energy that is there every single time. And for now, whether or not connected to grid for solar, well, I think the batteries that we have now, technologically, we can have a storage for 4 hours on the grid. That did not, it's not very helpful for places, where, think about the Texas freeze, right? It really has been an issue, even with the access to all of the above, literally. So solar is great, I think, particularly kind of advancing or helping, bringing up standards of living. But if you want to think about the whole development as economic development, for now, solar and wind are not enough. If you want to incorporate them within your entire electricity grid system, then there is also a very huge investment that's needed for a grid. And that's often what these developing countries don't have. And I think, that's technology, I'm sure, will increase the opportunities. But for now, it's not enough, particularly if you want to develop economically. And coal, domestically available, provides jobs to the society, which later votes for you and can vote you out of the office. It's kind of still there. India it has been problems with incorporating natural gas. It's the pipeline issues and the monopoly of the states over pipelines and its capacity. And building new pipelines is expensive. Building new terminals is expensive, but it's actually progressing on that. India's progressing on that.
Can I ask one final question? With this kind of like emergence of kind of like renewables, particularly electric vehicles, as a way of kind of like tackling climate emergency, do you think that's likely to come to if not a shuddering halt, certainly a massive slowdown because of scarcity of rare earth minerals that are needed in the production of batteries and so on?
I mean, it's really a concern. And again, it's so I really encourage, if anybody's interested in critical minerals, I really encourage you to kind of go into our website and look for Michelle Michot-Foss, the one that she actually she had invited me to write the book with her. She has been working on this extensively. She has recently actually testified to Congress about that. She has developed with people in that institute actually an interactive map where you can click and see where those minerals are, which again takes me to the issue of geopolitics. We should not kid ourselves that if we put a solar roof on, or solar panels and the wind in a country, that country is going to be, secure from the energy perspective. The fact that we can generate it locally doesn't mean that we can actually build it locally. And we've seen the issue of China kind of being monopolist in many ways in the solar industry, or really dominant power in the solar industry. We've seen that, Russia, China, these places have quite a lot of, monopoly over where these resources are. So the fact that, we have locally, we can locally generate doesn't mean that we're not dependent on other countries for that energy, just in a different way. And that, again, introduces the issues of geopolitics in the process and how other countries can impact what we do by potentially, disturbing our access to certain components or critical minerals and so on, and that's quite important to think of.
Fantastic. Justin, you had a question, and then Anna, if you wanted to get any more slides that you wanted to do, we still have some time to do those as well after Justin's question.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mark. My question is, you touched on LNG a little bit, and I was curious on your thoughts regarding US LNG exports and where you foresee that heading. There's things like the Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming from Russia into Europe, and other nations likely hopefully tapping into their reserves, their natural gas reserves, and then also adopting, frac technology and things like that. I mean, right now LNG seems quite promising, but in the long run, do you foresee that still being an international market, or do you see, it's sort of shifting because everyone has access to local gas?
Oh, yeah, I don't think everybody will have access to local gas. Gas is not as widely distributed globally as, for example, coal is. In addition, even though there is quite a lot of gas in many more places, including the developing world, it involves a lot of investment that those countries don't have resources for. Their credit rating doesn't allow for a huge influx of foreign investment. There's issues on the ground and so on. So I think there's still going to be specific countries that are going to be dominating the gas market. However, we've seen, and I don't have the slide here, but we've seen a huge expansion in both suppliers and also customers for LNG as it developed, and I think that's quite important. And you've mentioned Nord Stream 2, which kind of goes, and it really kind of works well with the theme. So which I wanted to kind of focus on what the US-Russia kind of issues are. And I think one of the biggest issues that Russia and US have been involved in terms of geopolitics is natural gas. And US LNG has been quite an important point in the contention there. So kind of, giving you the background, Russia has been dominant supplier for the European market. Approximately 40% of European gas comes from Russia. For European gas demand is supplied by Russia. Russia has been really, and this is happening since 1970s, since Cold War. Russia has supplied Germany, France, Italy, and so on in natural gas. And there hasn't been many issues. Well, part of it is because those countries had also access to other sources of gas, right? From North Africa and Spain, access to LNG, even though more expensive. Own resources, domestic resources were also available, particularly in the Netherlands, in the Groningen field. Now, Eastern Europe is a totally different ballgame because Eastern Europe, over the period of the communism, has been really made dependent on Russian imports, and you haven't seen the development of, for example, gas network, gas pipelines in the way they developed in the Western Europe to balance the markets and provide the flows of gas between different countries and different markets, and in that balance the market. You haven't seen this. You kind of seen really those pipelines, two pipelines literally going from Russia all the way to Western Europe through Eastern Europe, and kind of no pipeline in between, and then kind of expansion of pipelines in Germany, kind of more little pipelines dividing and cutting through the markets. And Russia has used its monopoly or dominance in Central Eastern Europe many times after the Cold War. Until the Cold War, until 1989, 1990s, these countries were dependent on it. There was no problems. There was no disagreements. There couldn't be. Well, it started becoming issues. There has been many things that have been dividing those countries after 1989 and 1919, where countries in Eastern Europe were looking not only to access NATO, but also EU and so on. And Russia has always kind of, didn't like it and used sometimes gas, particularly in Ukraine, to make Ukraine do what it wants. And in many ways, for example, so it would price gas cheaper than market value. And then when Ukraine wanted to, for example, get better market rules in terms of with the EU, it decided to hike up the prices to the market value. It just was acting as a regular market actor, right? I mean, it just wanted the market value, but the fact is that it kind of really was doing this on purpose. Same thing would allow Ukraine to accumulate huge amount of debt. So not only was the prices low, but they were able to accumulate a huge amount of debt. But whenever Ukraine wanted to do something that Russia wasn't fond of, they would ask for repayment of that debt. In Russia would portray it, well, we just want our money back, but really it was the timing of that ask that was important. So because of this, the countries in Central and Eastern Europe really pushed for diversification of their supply. Sure, Russian gas could be the cheapest. Could be, but not necessarily. If Russia is a monopoly, well, then they can ask for whatever they want for that gas, right? So, and really places like Poland and Lithuania have actually built their own terminals, LNG terminals, and most recent is actually Kirk in Croatia. It just opened this year. A new terminal that was supposed to open years before, but they just opened, so kind of adds to that diversification. On its part, Russia figured out this is not probably a good thing. They have an issue with Ukraine. They cannot often agree on the market rules or on the rules of the transit. How about we build pipelines that go directly to Germany, our biggest, our largest customer. I think they have imported 90 BCMs and most of it from Russia over last year and the year before. So huge customer. And we just go around Ukraine and we have access to Europe. And in that way, potentially we slow down the push to access other sources of gas, including LNG, including US LNG.
Anna, what will happen to Germany if it becomes dependent on Russia for natural gas?
So there is, I mean, it's already dependent on Russia for natural gas. It is. The fact is, it's such a large market that, you know, it's the big supplier, big customer, where Russia is just as dependent on Germany for demand as Germany is dependent on Russia for that gas. In addition, Germany is, as I've mentioned, very well connected to other markets. So it can actually, if it wants, it can bring, even though it doesn't have an LNG terminal, it can bring gas from other sources. So in that way, as long as you interconnected with other markets, you could be a big customer for Russia, and you could actually use, you know, all of the gas you're using might be from Russia, but you might not be dependent in a sense of, you know, doing what Russia wants or being able to Russia doesn't necessarily have to geopolitically influence you because you are able to turn away and reach for other sources. And I think that's what's very important. You know, this kind of goes to the point. It's a very good question because it goes to the point of geopolitics of energy and geopolitics of gas, particularly in Europe, but also in other places. It's not from where you're getting gas at the time, it's where you can get your gas from if you need to. And that goes back to the idea of energy security. So you are, you know, and you are more than welcome to get just one source, but if you don't have access to other sources, that one monopoly supplier not only can geopolitically have geopolitical power, but also has economic power over you. So, and that's what's been happening actually in Central and Eastern Europe. Not only the geopolitical power was there from Russia, but also Russia as dominant supplier and often monopoly supplier. Lithuania, for example, was 100% dependent on all gas, and there had been no other access to gas. So in that situation, even though Russian gas was cheaper in terms of cost of its development and transit, or it was cheaper for Germans who were able to basically, you know, bargain on its price based on other supply that they have access to, Russia could dictate prices in Central and Eastern Europe and actually charge places like Poland, like Lithuania, and so on, prices higher than it charged Germany or Italy, despite the fact that transit there is longer. So you see that there's, you know, economic and geopolitical power that relates to energy supply if the market is not diversified enough and doesn't have access to other supply sources. And in that, energy security of a country is impacted. And we've seen that there is a very good realization of that, for example, in China. And I've mentioned how China has really pushed very hard for diversifying its energy supply. So, you see access to oil, solar, wind, gas. And with gas, it's very interesting because China hasn't been, depending on one source. It has access to LNG. It has gotten access via new pipeline, Power of Siberia, from China, from Russia. And it has access, to other pipeline from the post-Soviet republics, like Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan and so on. So China has really seen this, and this is actually also what's happening in Central Eastern Europe. So it's very important. Now, where does US LNG come from? And it's lots of people say, well, US LNG cannot compete on price in Europe. Most of the time, it cannot. Russian gas can be cheaper. Russia can undermine the prices for most of the part in terms of longer term contracts with the US LNG. But still, places like Poland, Lithuania, Turkey, they've started signing long-term LNG contracts with US companies. Why is that? Why they are kind of are they not looking at the prices that they could be getting from Russia? Well, this concern about geopolitical power of Russia over their economies and over their policies. So US LNG is important for Europe in both economic and geopolitical term, and any LNG really is important there because access to more supplies basically makes Russia just another supplier, even if it supplies most of the gas at a time. But the ability of those countries to access other sources of gas is paramount. And that goes back to the bigger picture of geopolitics and what US LNG and US oil exports have actually provided for the global energy markets. For gas, for example, and we really point to this in our book, but also recently with Michelle, we have written a blog on Forbes on that, and in the book we point to this, how important it is that the entry of the US energy supply has introduced not only new supply, which is important, but also introduced new rules of the game particularly in terms of natural gas. It has introduced more flexible contracts, free on board principles, for example. So basically, for example, Poland has a 20-year contract with Cheniere, but they can pick up that gas that they buy and sell it wherever they want to. They don't need to bring it back to Poland if the prices on the spot in Europe are better. They can just send it back, send it to Asia. In the same way, you can even cancel US LNG shipments, and we've seen this actually over the COVID in 2020. Mid-year, there has been quite a lot of cancellations of US LNG, which was hard on those companies. Was hard on LNG producers and kind of, the rest of the world, particularly the Qataris, were able to kind of, sell their gas as US contracts were being canceled. But it also introduced this kind of one dimension of competition to the market, which now places like Qatar, like Russia, like other supplier of natural gas have to think, what do I need to compete on? I cannot only compete on price. I have to be also more flexible. And if not, the countries might choose other supplies over me because it adds to their energy security and security of supply. And I think that's very important. And the other thing that's quite important is actually decarbonization. As I've mentioned, US LNG would be highly beneficial if it replaces coal, not only in Asia, but from whatever we looked at in Europe, in Latin America, and so on. It would be highly beneficial if it replaces coal from the decarbonization standpoint. In addition, when you think about US LNG, it's not the US government LNG. It's the private companies. They are much more transparent, work based on market principles, and in that add this market. Market is not predictable. You cannot predict the market, right? But at least you know that if supply goes up, the demand goes down, and what happens, right? You kind of know the forces that work there. So you can position yourself based on what you think the forces will be. Now, if supply is dependent on policy, particularly policies in countries that we are not best friends with, like Russia or China, well, then we're in much more trouble because we cannot potentially predict what the policies could dictate in terms of supplying natural gas to one way or another. So that's another kind of, the transparency, the market base of US supply, both in terms of natural gas as well as in terms of oil, provides huge energy security benefits globally. And it basically, so the geopolitical power of the US gas, it's not only what US government can get out by conditioning supply, because it cannot condition supply, really. It is the companies that will or will not sell their gas based on what markets they're telling them. But it decreases the geopolitical power of other countries. It decreases the amount of influence countries like Russia might have in Europe, for example. And that's the big geopolitical benefit that US supply has, whether or not it reaches the shore of Europe, whether or not it reaches the specific, Chinese terminal. As long as we have it in the mix, it provides the market benefits. But also, the LNG market is increasingly fluid, deeper. So it doesn't matter where US LNG is going. It just kind of you're moving supplies from one place to another. Important is that every of these spots can access different supply sources. And that's when the geopolitical value of energy, of gas or oil decreases. And in a way, it's funny to say that it becomes more predictable, or at least we can predict its movement based on market movement rather than trying to guess what governments want.
Thank you, Anna. And I just, we have about 15 minutes left or so. I want to invite folks from the audience to, ask questions. You mentioned US independence. We've got Barry Rather in the audience. Barry, do you have, he's our board member with CIPES. Barry, do you have any input to add to what Anna just said regarding US independence? No microphone. Okay, no worries.
Yeah.
Thanks. Anyone, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. We definitely want this to be conversational. Thank you. Ken?
Anna? Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Anna. This is Rob Shaw again. Just another question is that, everything you said is, for those of us in the energy market understand this. In terms of what happens on Capitol Hill in the US, has this actually been integrated into, do people understand these dynamics, or do they have other agendas which sort of have us go elsewhere? Because these trends have been out there for a long time, but it seems like not everyone on Capitol Hill has understood the dynamics and the benefits of what actually has transpired in the US energy market over the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I think, it's hard. I think there are some that understand and some that then don't, and there's some that understand but won't because their constituencies want something else, right? So it's the politics is kind of difficult. But one thing that's quite important is that we haven't seen a move from the Biden administration that would, for example, push for closing LNG terminals or decreasing LNG exports. In fact, to the contrary, we actually see Gronholm has been talking about, making sure that that pertains, and that how it could be beneficial to decarbonization of the developing world. We've heard this from administration. We haven't seen heard much from Biden himself, but there's a lot of that's not. There is ambiguity, I guess, that's present on that, and I think that ambiguity is very much, by design. Just because the government sees how important not only globally the US oil and sector is in terms of, for example, natural gas being the decarbonization tool, but also locally and domestically, it's quite important part of the economy. So disturbing that part of economy would really create an issue for US economic development, and by extension for anybody who wants to get elected. So I think there is this mix of different principles. What we've seen, definitely we've seen that the government is not keen on coal, which it's getting taken care by itself, given how much cheaper natural gas is now in the US to use from coal. We haven't seen any coal generation being planned, obviously. We might see some resurgence of coal at points, in regionally where coal could become at points slightly cheaper, so the existing coal generation would work harder than gas and so on. But yeah, I think there is an understanding that we cannot, resurrect coal pretty much, but also that as much as we want to push for more renewables, it's not practical. And I think, I think going forward on international scene, there should be a push of showing how important having a source of, for example, natural gas that's market-based, that's transparent, that has decarbonization benefits for global consumption is. I think that's where the administration should go. Of course, there's constituency that will make it more difficult, and that's why we see ambiguity and things that are remaining unsaid on the Hill.
Thanks, Anna.
Mm-hmm.
So, Anna, this is Ken Sill in Houston. I've been watching this happen for the last 25 years, and the political rhetoric around climate change and fossil fuels is all about, scaring people and terrifying them and saying it's the end of the world. If you do anything to counter that narrative by actually citing real data or statistics, or talking about the fact that, fossil fuels aren't just going to go away and we can't replace them with, you build all these electric cars, the electricity's got to come from everywhere. And the energy business is the worst PR business in the universe. The things they've done to help people, they just don't get it. But, the US is ahead of the Kyoto protocols. We didn't sign the treaty because of natural gas. China is going to keep doing whatever they're going to do because coal is cheap, but they're starting to see gas now that they've found reliable sources of supply that are closer, right? They're getting it from Russia. They see Australia and Indonesia. But what is going to change the political? This could end up being a disaster because they're against pipelines, they're against natural gas, they're against fracking, and fracking is what made gas cheap. And it actually, I keep looking at the world going, if we were really contaminating groundwater all over the United States, we have this thing called the plaintiff's bar in the US. Oil companies would be being sued for billions of dollars. But if you bring up any of these pragmatic facts, you're ridiculed and run out of town on a rail. It's political suicide for a Democrat to talk about this.
Yeah, and unfortunately that is true, and it's very hard to think about how to change this. There is this really especially when I teach at UPenn and I teach graduate courses, it's always interesting to hear what people have to say. And when I ask it, what's the point of climate change, is I get rid of fossil fuels, and until then I'm like, well, it's not. it's getting rid of CO2, and you can do it many different ways. And there is nothing good or bad about resource. There is a good or bad how we use it, right? And to achieve specific goals. And I think that's part of what the energy industry needs to think of. And I think, part of it is to make itself more, transparent, make sure that you really kind of, pulling all the strings in terms of, being environmentally conscious in what you're doing, and ESG protocols could probably help. And it's going to be very difficult. It's very difficult to talk about it. Now, when you think about it, politicians have very short time horizon, right? So it's one thing that that I was so kind of really, it always made me very depressed. One thing that I learned in graduate school in political science is like when there was this one lecture and saying what's the goal each politician has as soon as they get elected. Well, to get elected again. It's not the policy. It's to get elected again. So that's, unfortunately, we have seen it on display for many years now. And that's something that it's very hard to kind of work against. Now, my concern is that what happens if if everybody gets, if we push a lot of money into climate change, kind of, more renewables and so on, it's not going to stop the changes, it's not going to stop climate change, right? It might stop it in long term in the future, but it will not stop it. So at some point it will turn against those who are trying to, push only one narrative, because, you think about, and that's kind of what Germany, I think, is standing against, right? You push this really expansive clean energy move, people pay more money for electricity and so on, and they still being hit by the same issues that they were before. So I just wonder when it will hit. So we kind of think about all of the above. We think about, and it's very important, we think about clean energy, we think how we develop, we think how the world does develop, but we also prepare for what will happen. We prepare for more hurricanes because they will happen, whether or not we'll decrease our use of fossil fuels nowadays. And I think, we make sure that we prepare for floods and so on. So the development has to be all of the above. But I don't think, as a political scientist, it's I always look at it, it's like, how can we deal with it? And it's very hard. In a way, it's easier for autocratic countries to do that, right? China can do whatever they want. They can build their coal power plants. They can build, natural gas. They can build solar. They can build hydro and displace thousands of people. In a way, it's easier than in democracies. Not that I would endorse the Chinese model, but it's very hard for the US and really, I don't know what the answer is. I think, economic advancement kind of helps. So we'll see a lot of things being done under, like, kind of, on the, in a quiet, without being advertised. Lots of people don't remember that it was Obama who allowed US to kind of, got rid of the ban on oil exports. He actually streamlined a lot of the policies that allowed LNG development, and LNG, all the LNG development that happened now and has been shipping that LNG happened under Obama. None of the shipments of the LNG actually were, yet were under Trump, because it takes time to develop these projects, right? 4 to 6 years. So Democrats talk quite a lot about, how they would like to change and what, but they do also understand the economics and the economics of voting. So while I don't expect the dialogue to change that much, I don't also expect huge amount of change in a way we see it in Europe, because of how much of resource the US has. For companies, I think it's very important to think about how to make themselves more transparent, monitor make sure that they don't, create issues where they are liable for spills and so on. And if they are, then live up to it, create monitoring system and so on. And government should also make sure that, things like methane emissions are constrained and so on. It almost creates a niche for the US. It almost where the US can basically, market itself as the place where you can get energy from a transparent source. You know how much emissions there's been. The emissions are as constrained as possible. And it almost reminds me of the differences between international oil companies and national oil companies. With international oil companies really focusing on those difficult developments, right? The offshore development or so on. It's not because it's cheaper. It's because they can do it. They are specialized in that. The NOCs, they're not specialized. They just dig and they get their oil out of the ground because it's quite easy most of the time. But it's the expertise, the development, the research, all is going on into international oil companies. And it can provide a great kind of, it's like organic versus non-organic milk or so on, where people, particularly in the developed world, might be looking, well, there is a quality concern, and we want to go with the one that we know where it comes from and what processes have been used and so on. And as the developing world develops, if we make it competitive in terms of cost, as well as provide energy security benefits, it could be a way to go.
Excellent, thank you. And just got a comment from Barry Rava, who doesn't have a mic, but he's on the board of SITE, Society of Independent Professional Scientists, been in the industry for 40 years, and he actually loves the Democrats. Under the Democrats, prices are always increasing if you can stay in business. So, and then we'll take a final question from Raghu, and then if you haven't shared your information in the chat, please do. We definitely want folks to network. If you have any projects that you're working on, et cetera, this is a great place to connect with people. And, obviously we're not in person, but I think the Zoom allows people to do that efficiently. So please tell people what you're up to and share your information. And Raghu, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think, the comment that I had to make for Anna is the Western perception of development is flawed. I say this with a healthy dose of skepticism. Agreed, the West needs to focus on renewables as a critical part of the energy mix. However, the Western model of development and consumption can be really disastrous for countries just say India. For example, they recycle a lot of items that get discarded in the US and Canada. Also, if you look at the per capita energy consumption in terms of kilowatt hours, Canada is about 1.25 times that of the US, and Russia is about half of that of Canada, and India's per capita energy consumption is about 7% of that of Canada. The fact about India, nearly 67% of the Indians live in rural villages, while the scorched earth policy, AKA embracing more fossil fuels, is possibly not a way forward. Opting possibly for the micro solar installations in India, perhaps even in Africa, may help overcome the shortcomings in grid connectivity. If you have lived in big cities, which are highly populated, which had less fossil fuel vehicles versus what they have now, you will realize a lot of these cities have become unlivable, causing widespread migration. So how do you balance that kind of a scenario?
Yeah, I think you are very much right. I mean, if particularly if we think, or if that countries like India, other Southeast Asian countries develop the trajectory that the West has developed, it would be a disaster for the world in terms of climate and so on. And I think that's also something that we need the leapfrogging, right? We need them not to have the phone landlines just switch to the cell phones, just like they did with the cell phones. It's kind of we really need that to happen with energy supply, and in that way, the research that's been done, and it should be done, and it should be connected on how to use clean energy, how to reuse material, what to do with waste, and so on. It should be integrated between the developed and developing world to look for solutions that work for both. If the developed world looks for only solutions that work for them, they're usually too expensive. All right. There has to be support. I mean, if we want to have, if we want to have clean air or CO2 decrease, we need to think about it in the global scale as opposed to a local scale. So when you think about, you stop producing gas and oil, what happens? Others will produce it, and they might not be as clean as you. They won't care because for being clean or so on and so on, or cleaner and so on. So it's not really gonna help. Or oil and gas and coal become cheaper, which means now the countries that don't have much money will use it because this will be the cheapest energy available. Kind of, again, working against your idea at first to cut amount of fossil fuels on the market. So I think it's important to develop solutions that are encompassing. Again, I don't see enough of discussion of that. I don't know why, and kind of, we almost got kind of sucked into the idea we can work, we can live on sunshine and wind without considering of all that stuff that needs to be set up for it to really work. And at this point, we do not have technology to do that. Unfortunately, something it's only good or bad will. Well, that's not the case. And I think that's important to, it's important for, I think one message that we need to kind of, think of to everybody, it's important to understand, for people to understand what they are getting from different types of fossil fuel or so on. When, the North Face jacket that they are wearing, it's made with fossil fuels, right? Or another type of, so I think it's important that they know that they are aware what they're getting from what, so then they can kind of really stop and think. And I don't think there has been enough of that. And it's a dangerous political discussion for the politicians, of course.
And finally, how should the US devise its foreign policy towards Putin and Russia, particularly in the wake of the Biden-Putin summit this June, where not many solutions paths forward have been accomplished?
So I actually have written another article in The Hill, and I'm pasting it into that because it really responds to your question. But what I basically, in a nutshell, is that Russia is not the same superpower it has been under Cold War. It has declined significantly in terms of its economic power, military power, and ability to influence the world, also through energy, because of the development in energy, including natural gas. It has, and it's interesting because I think energy really points to Russia becoming just a regular participant of international affairs. Think OPEC plus. Yes, Russia has increased its position in terms of oil supply because OPEC needs it to keep the pricing at the levels it wants them to be. However, it's not Russia that decides on it, and it has to kind of Russia has to work together with other countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, to achieve anything. Again, not a superpower, not a hegemon in a way that it was in Cold War. Nord Stream 2 is another thing. The US didn't impose more sanctions on Nord Stream 2 because it valued more its relation with Germany than the ability of Russia to build a pipeline, particularly under the conditions where increasing amount of European countries can access other supply sources for natural gas. And also because US really needs its allies, its traditional allies like Germany, France, Italy, and so on, to work with them against what is becoming really a threat in geopolitical sense of it, China. So I think it's very important to kind of, Russia is willing to be a malign power. It's willing to mess in the affairs. It's gonna engage, but it's not the same type of power it used to be under Cold War and should be treated as such. And I think that's, I think Biden and Putin have met, but you see there wasn't much that came out of that meeting, really not much. And in my view, both of them met not to achieve, international goals in a way, kind of, but really domestic goals. So Putin has shown its population that it still counts. It gets this special, treatment by the US, which has been by many criticized, because they said, well, we shouldn't behave as if Russia was the same power as US. On the other hand, Biden, I think, wanted to have this kind of to set up a stage, show how it is different, how he is different, and how different he treats Russia compared to earlier administration, and that it will not. Basically, it shows power and strength against Russia. It will not be subservient to that country, that it will meet with them, but will not give away any of it of the power that internationally US has. I don't see US-Russia relations becoming close. I think they will participate in some of the relations will be on things on a need-to-be basis, but the U.S. administration will be really focusing on the issues of China. In some ways, it could give Putin the small victories like Nord Stream 2, but it's a tough one, because Putin really one of the things that Putin really wanted for 20 years he's in power is to put Russia back where it was in terms of its international might and international position, where it was under Cold War. Do
you think Russia can become a geopolitical issue for the US in the way that it used to be during the Cold War?
I don't think so. The way it has not developed economically, the huge amount of issues, domestic economic issues it has, it doesn't point to it becoming a major power, and so on. It will be important because it's happily engaging in malicious activity. So we will have to be paying attention to it, just like we're paying to North Korea and other places that not necessarily are our friends. But it will not be a country which we will first discuss things and then influence others. So what you've seen with the EU, summit, you've seen Biden meeting with everybody else and then meeting with Putin, which indicates is that it really wanted to make sure that it incorporates all the other positions to make it to its position and its discussion with Russia, not otherwise, where he would meet in Putin, set up a stage, set up specific goals, and then go back to EU, Germany, and so on to develop those goals or develop policies, according to those goals.
Superb. And then Anna, if you could just give us a brief summary, and then just once again share information with us. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. My name is Mark Erabogbo. I'm chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Special Interest Group with the FANG, Financial Executives Networking Group.
Thank you very much, everybody. Please make sure that if you have any additional outstanding question, I see Amar was having a question and I didn't get to
Mark,
you.
Can I ask one last question?
Yes, please do. Thank you.
I'm happy to stand by. I mean, I don't have anything planned for another half an hour, but I know both Mark and others might, but I'm happy. Yeah, please go ahead with the question.
Amar, I think you froze.
Oh, no.
Amar froze. Ben, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Was probably the next big potential.
Oh, no. Well, okay, great. Ben was like, what? He asked me. That was funny.
Well, I play with my head constantly. That's my fault. Although, I mean, one thing that I've noticed just in Uzbekistan, which is on the periphery of Russia, they're moving toward reducing their carbon footprint, but it's clear that the only reason they're doing that is so they can export more to China.
Yeah.
Because they're investing in solar over the last year.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on economic reasons, not the climate reason that we think of, right? It's the same, or air quality reasons. So a lot of stuff that China has, a lot of the coal-fired power plants that China has closed down is because of air quality reasons. not because of climate reasons, right? So I think that's also important. And that's one way in which we can think of how to encourage the developing world to switch, for example, from coal. That, you know, it might be actually much more persuasive than talking about climate change or decarbonization, because when you think about it, air quality is localized, you can feel it right away. Decarbonization or climate change is everywhere, right? It's whatever you do doesn't necessarily impact you and doesn't impact you right away or anybody else right away. So again, it's this abstract thing that lots of people have difficulties thinking about, particularly if they always think about survival, how to survive to the next day, how to feed your family, how to make sure that you have your house warm when you're not connected to grid, right? How not to die from indoor pollution when you're preparing food for your children every day in a stove and using charcoal. So, or biochar or so on. So I think that's important. That's one way in which we have to think about what are the incentives that might be different from ours.
Superb. And then I see Sharon Rector's in the audience. Sharon, do you have anything to add to the conversation?
No, actually, I'm not directly from that part of the energy. I'm from more the energy services side, where we actually go out and we build like those offshore rigs that you see. So it was just, I just have an interest in it and living in Texas. So it was a very, very interesting conversation. And I'm actually going to click on some of those links and read a little more. So Anna, thank you very, very much. I think you articulated it well. And I think you made it very understandable for somebody that is not necessarily in a company that is in, that industry per se.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, can I just quickly ask my question now?
Of course, go ahead.
It's defrosted.
So yeah, I think the internet connection here is a bit unstable, so hopefully you'll get my question. The question is probably the next big thing in kind of like the energy markets is potentially hydrogen. But the problems with hydrogen is, although we've known about the potential of hydrogen for a long time, is perfecting the technology to actually make it something that we can actually use on a big scale. What are the kind of like developments in the pipeline for this potentially exciting new technology?
So there is quite a huge amount of interest in hydrogen, and we see actually two ways in which hydrogen kind of will be entering the discussion. And one way is the European way, where it's being pushed by policy. Particularly, is the green hydrogen. So we'll see a lot of money that will actually come into many projects that will be, renewable energy, electrolysis, and basically producing green hydrogen without CO2 emissions or with limited CO2 emissions, since there is a lifetime cycle emission in renewables. And then there is, on the American side, there is quite a lot of discussion about creating market for hydrogen, because that's exactly, it's very difficult to create, technologically, even if you have, technologically you might be able to, but if there is no market, if there is no demand, how do you create supply, right? Or if there is a supply, how do you create the demand, and so on? And I think it's quite difficult, and potentially creating a hub could help. We think about, natural gas hub that in which a market could develop. And but the way we look at it, and please make sure that you kind of read, keep checking out and sign up to on our LinkedIn page, and Twitter if you have, because we have quite a lot of research that's coming that way. And we really will be looking, technology agnostic in terms of building hydrogen market, because we feel that, and I think myself, I feel hydrogen could be an amazing way to transform our energy system, but particularly so because it's so diverse It's so diverse because it can be produced from many options: coal, natural gas, renewables, and also can be used in so many ways. So in a way, it's an amazing type of resource that can provide many countries with different solutions, but ending in the same hydrogen. And you can develop markets, and I've mentioned this particularly, I've been thinking about it quite a lot in the context of coal, thinking about Poland, my country, which coal is kind of really pervasive and difficult to get rid of, also for societal and political reasons, jobs, unions, the ability of literally minors voting out of office any single government because of how they are set up, how the unions are set up, and the type of very close elections in Poland. And when you think about, it's very difficult to change those coal mining regions. What do you do? But if you introduce hydrogen, you could still actually use that coal, create hydrogen, build an economy with well-paid jobs, which is important, and slowly transition to other types of hydrogen if you need be. Or you can use decarbonization ways like CCS and others to decarbonize natural gas or hydrogen from natural gas and so on, or even coal. But I think it's important to think about hydrogen. I mean, for me, the biggest value is in how diverse it is, both in terms of resources that you need for its production and also applications.
Excellent. Well, this was a conversation with the Financial Executives Networking Group. Thank you very much, Anna Mikulska. Everyone, I'm sure you have her information. We look forward to you joining us on our next session. My name is Mark Hamza Arabogbo. I'm chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Special Interest Group. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.